Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Ho, 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 it's Christmas time and the holidays and things. So many holidays. And we should probably have a music here. We'll put that in editing. Hey, welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 178. Today we're talking about Chrome Dev Summit and all the recap, all the things. We are Justin, Leon, and Danny. Danny, Leon, good to see y'all.
Hey.
Hello, Justin.
It is the magical time, the holidays where ideally code freezes happen and people, get a little warm in their heart because the code freezes happened and they don't have to panic about that next patch. But before we get into,
you're just running around with your head on fire.
I feel that's the thing, right? I mean, realistically, I think everybody's code freeze is usually December 15th if we're lucky. One can hope, one can dream, but it is the season of hope. That's what I'm told.
That's what they tell me on TV.
And speaking of hopeful things, we were quite surprised to find that there's actually a lot going on for December. So we're going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about this week in the web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thanks, Justin. So first of all, version 3.4 of Elix Elements has just been released. So this includes a number of new web components and mix-ins for the Combo Box family. So that was pretty cool. So go and check out the link to find out more. This is quite a big one, if you believe it. So not had any official announcement that I've seen anyway from Microsoft, but apparently Microsoft is building a new browser based on Chromium and it's going to replace Edge. So yeah, don't know whether that's exactly true yet. So if anybody knows, please shoot us up on Twitter and let us know. But also let us know what you think about that. I think a lot of people will probably initially think, yay, one less browser to test. But then maybe some people are concerned about Chrome basically becoming the next IE 11, or the lack of different opinions in the different browsers might be quite damaging there. So let us know what you think on Twitter. That'd be really cool. There's also been a small feature release of Webpack. So that's version 4.27. So check out the link for more details on that particular release. This was quite a cool one. So Microsoft just released Onyx.js. That's not a Pokemon. It's a JS library which allows you to run open neural network exchange models in the browser on the GPU and CPU, and that uses WebAssembly to do that. So that looks very interesting indeed. And one for Danny. Happy Christmas, Danny. TypeScript 3.2 is out. This includes loads of new features and improvements. So check out the link to find out more. And that's everything from me for this week in web. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Yeah, the news post yesterday with the Chromium thing was quite the show on Twitter.
It certainly was.
I honestly do not know what I think about that. Again, like there's no official word that this is happening, so we don't know, but it certainly did spark a debate.
Yeah, I'm of two opinions, which I suppose is another show we can do, because I figure we would just start. It would start off, cool, and then it would just turn into us screaming about something. I figure that's most browser debates at this point. But we're not talking about browser debates today. No, we're talking about Chrome Dev Summit, which just occurred a couple weeks ago, and there was a lot going on at Chrome Dev Summit this year. It was in San Francisco. All three of us were actually there, which was very cool. But beyond the fact that we're going to talk about a lot of the things that were on stage and whatnot, there was a significant, we talk about the current browser debates and whatnot. Pretty much every browser vendor was there. Like everybody was there. They had booths. Like it was a very sort of combinational atmosphere, one might say, which I thought was quite nice.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's nice to see, like you said, all the different browser vendors there. So it wasn't just a Chrome thing, really. There's lots of discussion around, just the web in general, as opposed to it just being, specific things kind of related to Chrome. So I agree. That was really cool to see.
Yeah, the platform ecosystem, we talk about the tooling and all the things that sort of make our websites go and make our web applications sort of reach the users we want. And there was a lot of those conversations that didn't make it onto the big screen and the sandboxes and whatnot. There was a significant, ongoing debate about, how do you eke out the most web performance? What is that going to look like? What are the next sort of series of specs going to be that, are, that folks are kind of interested in, that sort of haven't made it into the mainstream sort of media sort of life. I mean, when you all were in the sandboxes, did you feel like it was less of a, there was very, we see a lot of the arguments on Twitter, but there was really no argument in the sandboxes. It was very much, how do we make things better?
Yeah, I agree. And so also for a little bit of background, just of the overall layout, there was pretty much an auditorium where there were all of the talks that, so if you watch any of them on the live streams, they were all there. And then in the building next to it, there was a sandbox, what they called the sandbox, where there's just a bunch of booths and a bunch of people doing all kinds of crazy stuff, showing things. We saw a trumpet being controlled with the web. I think that was a thing that we saw.
Yeah, we're gonna have to have Yuri on for that one.
But
just amazing.
Yeah, but I agree. It's like it was the whole atmosphere was really good. It was a lot of people just being excited about new things coming to again, not just Chrome, but new things that the web can do. And I think that's some of the stuff that we're going to talk about, and like some things that are coming in the future, and actually a lot of things that are here now, and just showing what we can do to take advantage of them.
Yeah. And Justin was talking about kind of the overall discussions that were happening about how do we do things in the best way possible in terms of performance and all the best practices and those kind of things. So I think it's probably a good point to start with web.dev, the new site that got announced. So I don't know, anybody who would like to just start talking a little bit about that?
No, I think that's a good idea. Do you just want to give a brief summary of what web.dev is? Yeah,
as best as I possibly can. So I think it's a lot more than maybe what you kind of initially think. So it's basically a new site. Literally the URL is web.dev. It's currently in beta at the moment, where it basically provides loads of really good articles and learning materials to provide best practice ways of doing things like, fast load times, making your sites easily discoverable, PWA type stuff like installable, and all those other kind of different things, like a really great resource that provides lots of really high quality articles and tutorials on how to do these particular things all in one place. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I also think there's also, if you kind of sign up and sign in, you can run like lighthouse tests against various different sites and stuff. And there's like a dashboard which shows all of those statistics and provides insight into where your site could do better, all in one place. And then that links up to the different articles to kind of help you understand what things you can change to make those particular metrics better, etc. So it all seems pretty cool. I've not actually had a chance to really kind of try it out myself yet. I don't know whether either of you have.
Just a little bit. And so this is actually a good kind of offshoot into another thing that they talked about. They talked a lot about performance, and they talked a lot about measuring performance. And one of the things that they were talking about is actually that they want to use Lighthouse is, at least for Google, is the tool they're going to use. So like I said, web.dev uses it. Obviously it's in the available in the browser and the dev tools, and they're talking about using it other places as well. But it's interesting, I think, not just because. So what it kind of reminds me of is, so a lot of times if you're working on Android, for example, there's a bunch of Android documentation, right? If you're going to build for web, like you are probably getting, information about APIs in one place and CSS stuff in another place. And it's not that this is that like full reference, catalog, as it were, but but like some of that, the best practice stuff that comes from some of that documentation ends up being here, where it's just like, because everybody's been hearing, it's like your website has to load fast, and people have been banging that drum for a long time. And it's like, all right, well, how? Lighthouse was a good first step. But literally, if you go to web.dev, the first thing that you run into under the Learn tab is fast load times. It just tells you tells you why, it tells you how to measure, and it gives you a bunch of examples of things that you can do to help do that. So it's less random Googling to try to find out how do I do this, and more here's a curated document, for lack of a better term, that will help you with some of these common problems or challenges.
And it definitely, ideally, will be a clearinghouse for a lot of the information that has sort of been scattered about, because there's quite a bit of information in terms of things that are in the pipeline for things like Chrome on developers.google.com.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have things, everyone's coalescing around MDN, so Mozilla's developer documentation, where basically all the browser vendors are pushing their things there now. So web.dev sort of, again, sort of becomes that clearinghouse of a thing. And ideally will make life easier for developers who are just getting started to start to find those resources that to some extent were somewhat hidden. Like, it is very hard to find, definitive sort of information, right?
Not only finding the stuff, but also knowing what you need to find is exactly a problem. And this web.dev is in a really nice format. So as Danny mentioned, so under the fast load times section, it's basically just like a checklist. So number 1, measure your site's performance. Number 2, optimize your images. Number 3, optimize your JavaScript. Optimize web fonts. Measure performance in the field and enforce performance budgets. Then under each of those different kind of main points is loads of information about how to do different things to kind of meet those particular checkpoints. So really good format and loads of really good information in one place. It's easy to find. Hopefully will help a lot of people figure out how to kind of do these things. I know it's definitely going to help me for sure. Yeah,
I think it'll be very helpful. And once content starts to flow there, Chrome Dev Summit just did happen, and as we get through the new year, I think we'll really start to see web.dev take shape. For those out there who are interested in what updates are going on, Rob Dodson, who
friend of the show, Rob Dodson,
yeah, friend of the show, working on things like Polymer and accessibility these days. He's also been working on web.dev. So if you follow him on Medium, you will find that they're doing status updates pretty much on a weekly basis of what's interesting and new and all the things they're fixing for web.dev. And if you have comments, make sure that you head over to the GitHub repo, which we'll put in the show notes. So if you have things that you want to contribute to or say, hey, this looks like a bug, become part of that conversation. Everyone likes contributions.
So another thing that I would actually like to talk about as well, because we were just talking about performance stuff. So there were actually a couple announcements around frameworks, and I was wondering, do you guys want to dig into some of that stuff now?
Yeah, I think so. I think the notion of what the Chrome folks have decided to do in terms of frameworks and the fund and the notion of additional layered APIs and all that stuff, I think it's a really interesting story. Danny, you want to start us off of where do you want to start in that conversation? Frameworks, they're a thing, and we should use them still.
So there has been so anybody that follows any of this kind of stuff on Twitter, you've definitely seen the arguments that happen between maybe some use the platform folks versus some diehard framework folks, and the two aren't really in that strict of a competition. The use the platform folks want the platform to be good enough that you should want to use more of it, and the frame and folks that build and use frameworks, there's obviously a lot of productivity gains and just other things about them that we all like. So there seems to have been a bit of competition between the two, and it seems like everybody involved is like, well, that's not healthy for the community. So the Chrome team has been working with obviously the Angular team, Polymer team, internal teams at Google, but also React. I think some folks from Vue as well, to help figure out, it's like, okay, frameworks aren't going to go away. What can we provide for what APIs are required from the platform itself? What capabilities does it need so that we can build really good frameworks on top of it and still be extremely performant? If you're following React at all, a lot of the stuff around suspense, about around these other things, like, well, what does React need to really be able to accomplish these things the way they want? Scheduling is another one. Scheduling actually came up a lot in the entire throughout the entire thing. So point one is that framework communities and authors are working together with with the platform, with the browser vendors, in this case specifically Google, to help drive what we all want the platform to be, which is really good on its own. The second thing is actually, I think, a bit more of a surprise on top of that, is that Google is putting up money. They are going to have a fund of, I don't remember the amount, where
200,000, I think.
Is it 200,000?
I think so.
That sounds right. So yeah. We'll make sure that we confirm that and put it in the notes. But let's say around $200,000 to help frameworks get up to speed in certain areas. So the way that I understood it anyway is that, so let's say that I start framework X that starts to become somewhat popular, people use it, but then it has some performance, maybe it has some particular performance issues that are causing problems. Google will actually pay out of the fund to help get those things handled, to make sure. So it's not, because, I mean, anybody that does anything in open source, there's a big thing about it, a very big thing about it just recently, about, maintainers are not paid for their work. So this seems to be a way to try to help provide, if we're going to say, oh, you have to fix X, Y, or Z, let's make it worth it, like actually worth the time to do. Does that all sound about right?
It does to me. Yeah. I think it's such an interesting thing to do, and it kind of makes a lot of sense. Obviously, Google's really keen on, making the web experience better for everybody, and you can't do that just with web platform features and improvements if these fundamental problems are within the frameworks. So it seems like a great way to try and unblock some of those issues and just make the web better for everybody. So I was really kind of happy to hear that.
Yeah, I do think that's one of the things that surprised me the most.
I don't know that I don't know that it surprised me terribly. I mean, there's been so much debate, like in the run up to CDS this year, about sort of the performance problems that a lot of frameworks sort of have. I mean, we've talked about it on the show before, but I suppose that, this is direct action. This isn't, we're going to, magically, think about this in a year or so, but, this is, hey, fill out this form. You want to make a direct contribution. We will help you fund this out, because, I don't think it's, for all the people saying don't use frameworks, because there are that subset, it's really a question of don't use the in-performant variations of frameworks. Like, frameworks can be fast. You have to make sure you develop for them. And I think that's one reason performance took such a ginormous leap this year at Chrome Dev Summit, because, we talk about making frameworks faster, but the platform ideally as well underlying gets faster, which goes to things like WebAssembly and continuing to explore web workers and, the actor model thing that Surma and Paul Lewis talked about. All these things sort of play towards the, how can you start to develop apps, framework or not, that ideally makes things faster. So, can you find that performance at a much larger scale? Because those frameworks, we all know this, frameworks are not going to go away. If there's a reason that people use them. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't make them faster, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have features be considered from them. So, again, some of that gets lost in the argument from people who I don't necessarily think quite have the entire story online. But it's online; it's the internet. Hot takes galore.
The takeaway is that the browser vendors, particularly Chrome, obviously, are considering frameworks to be, a significant part of the whole ecosystem, and like an extension of the platform, and that should be considered as such because they solve some big problems and a lot of people are going to use them. So let's, find ways to help make them better, which I think is really, really good. And I think that kind of transitions slightly into this layered APIs kind of approach. So it's the first time I've heard of this before. So I don't know whether you know well enough to kind of give a good introduction as to what layered APIs are. I'm not sure I could.
Yeah, layered APIs. So if you look at the sort of extensible web sort of manifesto of things, the extensible web basically said, hey, we need low-level primitives so that we can build things on top of those things. So the problem is that, the common case that at least I use a lot is, app cache. App cache was this thing that was a black box that you didn't really know how it worked. And if you did, it still didn't quite work. And if you got it to work, you were, heavenly on earth sort of scenario at that point. But so the notion was that, okay, well, hey, that high level thing didn't quite work out the way we want. So we just want this huge thing. But the problem is that if you just only build the low level side of things, you end up having to ship a lot more code down the line to get things stacked up. So this, to some extent, this goes back to the framework thing, which is, hey, this is great. I can build these things because I now have low level access on the platform. But well, that means I have to ship a lot more high level code to give me high level features that I can fundamentally use. So, but the problem is that there's this dichotomy, right? Where, well, how do you build a high level API again for the web? Like, what does a high level API look like that's featureful enough to sort of give you that gradient where I still need to ship some code, but I don't need to ship all that code I had before. I don't need a 4 meg Webpack variation to bring the low level up. So, the goal really for layered APIs is that you basically you still want the low level features because we need them to be able to bring new capabilities that we just don't have. But at the same time, you still want to be able to build higher level features sort of layered on top of the low level stuff that still ships at the browser level. So the case really right now is and we got talked about at Chrome Dev Summit, and it's been around for a little while if you were sort of following on GitHub, which was the virtual scroller side of life, which was, what do you need to add to the platform to make the virtual scroller thing sort of work? But at the same time, from the low level, but at the same time, give you that high level API where I don't necessarily need to ship 3 megs down the line to make this all sort of work. And the kicker is that the goal for the layered API is to just reduce the load. Like, you're trying to reduce as much of what the end developer has to ship down the line. So I'm sorry, that's a really kind of lengthy thing. There's a whole explainer document too in terms of this. We'll link to in the show notes, but that's the general gist.
Yeah, I think that was a really, really good kind of explanation of how all that kind of works. So I suppose so in terms of the virtual scroller, so you've got like some low level APIs that kind of provide the fundamental features on the platform to kind of make that kind of thing happen, and also some things kind of come in which is like the visible and invisible DOM and all those kind of things. And then you've got some like a higher level API, which I think is implemented with JavaScript, but just as like a web component, I think, that then allows you to optionally opt into that code to then use that as like a low level primitive in your applications and stuff. Does that sound about right? Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, you're correct. The kicker is that you sort of have to ask yourself a series of questions as to whether the layered API makes sense. In terms of, is it a good sort of thing to use for this? Number one, do you have enough low level capabilities to make it work? Like, if you don't, then the layered API approach doesn't work because you still have to fill the lower level gaps first, right? A good example of this probably would have been say like Workbox. Like, if you didn't have Service Worker, could you make Workbox work as a layered API on top of it? And I'm kind of mixing this up, but generally speaking, it would be hard, right? It would be hard to implement that lib because you don't have the low level capabilities. So you really still have to ask yourself that. Same thing though. You're like, okay, well, hey, if it is a web component, can I style that thing correctly, right? So do I have shadow parts yet? Well, I don't have shadow parts yet, but I can still polyfill that out. So again, you're looking for something that can ship, and the virtual scroller is probably the biggest one because it's basically a UI component, right? But do you really want to add a UI component to the platform like straight away? Like, there's a lot of debate on that. So the goal being is that if you can get enough of those pieces together, built on top of the existing standards, still coming to the standard spot, you can get a nice little layered API that, again, lets you ship less code. And ideally, works within the ecosystem of tooling we have. So, if you need that virtual scroller in your framework, now you don't have to do all that work yourself in the framework. You can use the layered API approach and go, oh, okay, great. I still have these things that I need.
I do think the idea of putting custom elements, web components, whatever, straight into the browser, it's weird. It almost feels like like I'm sure a bunch of people remember the whole, oh hey, just put jQuery into the browser. Everyone, almost every website used it. Just make it a part of the browser. And so the way they were talking about it was almost like a standard library of something. Like they were even those like, this was all like future facing stuff, but there was like a proposal. It's like maybe there's actually like so it's like if you're in Rust or whatever and you import things from standard, it's like maybe there are standard pieces that are built in that are actually still just written as web components. They're still JavaScript running. It's nothing else other than that. Is an interesting idea to me for a couple of reasons. I'm not sure if it's a good idea or not yet. But the one thing that it does make is it means that polyfilling features isn't really a polyfill. You know what I mean? It's like it either loads, you're either loading, the implementation of this virtual scroller, for example, you're either loading it from straight from the platform where it sits, or you can load it yourself from a library, and it could be the exact same implementation. So I think some stuff like that is actually is an interesting way to approach it. Like I said, I'm not sure I don't know if it's good yet, but it's definitely a bit of a different take, especially for browser vendors to approach something like this.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, yes, because at the end of the day, you're basically not necessarily bound to it, I suppose, right? I mean, the notion that the notion of the layered APIs is that you're not using anything inherently on the platform that would require the spec to underlyingly change with it, right? You're basically not using like unexposed primitives on the platform. So I'm trying to think of an example of that might be. So let's say that you tried to use Shadow DOM before like Shadow DOM was a thing, because technically we had Shadow DOM, but no one knew it was there. Right. It was, it was the way video players and certain UI components within the browser worked for a long time, and no one cared because we had video as a tag, and, magically things worked. But again, we saw the problem with that, right? From a platform perspective, is that the primitive wasn't low enough that you could do the things you wanted with that. So, I think that ideally it gives us a much cleaner sort of implementation. Because you can't like changing a layered API isn't going to create that problem at the specification level, which means you don't have to necessarily change the core of what browser renderers are going to do, or whatever piece of that puzzle you're trying to make. And that would be, again, that's generally better for the platform. And again, it's better for authors. At that point, you have just a little bit more power at your fingertips. And I think that's the ultimate goal of this, that if the platform gives you that power, then you can build the things that you want to build without having, to cycle through. So yeah, I'm very curious to see. I mean, the virtual scroller component, which if you haven't taken a look at it, it is on GitHub. And you can see sort of the progression of how that component has sort of come along. You sort of see what that vision looks like. And I think that could lead to interesting things.
Yeah, and some of the potential new specs coming out to kind of support some of those, support the virtual scroll features sounds really interesting as well, particularly like invisible DOM. So for anybody who doesn't quite know what we're talking about when we say a virtual scroll, it's just the thing where you can basically take a list of, say, 20,000 items and kind of present them in a list, but you're only rendering, what you can visibly see, plus a few, headers and footers. So when you scroll, the kind of, and then it dynamically kind of brings everything in and takes things out of the DOM, and it's all very efficient. But kind of a big problem with that is that that means that you can no longer search for those things in the DOM. Because obviously it's not in the DOM tree, so you can't do like a find or whatever and kind of look for those particular things. So the way that they were kind of talking about solving that particular problem is having this concept of invisible DOM. So when you did find and those kind of things, it would still be able to find it, even though it's not actually rendered yet. And I have no idea how that actually works, but it sounds very interesting indeed.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of that, and there was a lot of that at Chrome Dev Summit, both conversations in the sandbox, but also in the talks about sort of experiments that are currently behind flags in Chrome, where, yeah, what happens if you have invisible DOM, and like how does that function? To some extent, this is very similar to the notion before we got the feature off-screen canvas rendering too. Like, there's value in some of that, right? Where we can get a lot of performance out of that. Same thing with like task worklets and, some of the stuff where the syntax hasn't quite been worked out all the way, but we know that these things would give us a little bit more control over sort of how we could do more work in sort of a more, we could do similar work, I suppose, to what we're doing now, but also more performant wise, right? We can start to fill in those gaps. And yeah, I'm always, again, like if you haven't looked at specs, I understand like specs, but the conversations are really good. Like if you're out there about, and we'll put some links in the show notes, but you should definitely read those conversations if you've got 10 minutes on a train somewhere. Like a lot of them give you a lot of insight to the way not only the platform is moving, but the way other developers are sort of interacting with these things, and why these things, you're like, wow, I don't even know why that would be a thing. Well, it's because, you could do work like this. That to me is interesting.
Yeah.
So something else I'd like to cover is how much stuff they also talked about that is not future facing, stuff that is here, like stuff that is available to be used and is sometimes underused. And of course, that means I'm talking about web workers, which
Danny,
like I don't.
Danny, do you like web workers? This is the first I've heard of this.
I was so happy. I was so happy that they were talking about it. And they were talking about web workers have some enormous flaws, some things that make them really difficult to work with. But they talked to me like how, like I learned some stuff even about how they worked, like why they are the way that they are. But the fact that like they are extremely useful and they're so seldom used. So I was really excited to see stuff about that. There's not really a lot else to say about web workers. There's a ton of content about it. We've talked about web workers and stuff in the past.
But I did doing a little dance in his seat.
I was so good. And I was
entertaining.
But yeah, no, but it was
true. It was really good to see. I completely agree.
And it showed up a lot. Like if you haven't watched all the talks yet, you will know web workers continue to make an appearance in quite a few of those talks.
And they weren't even brought like rolled out as like, oh, here's this crazy thing. It was mostly, hey, do you remember web workers? They're very widely supported, and here's a problem that we could not solve without it, which was really, really good. I said, I don't really have anything else much more to say about that other than to say that hooray that they were brought up.
Let me ask you this though, Danny. Let me ask you this.
Okay.
Because I know they brought this up in a couple of the talks, and I know that all three of us have probably experienced this having worked with web workers, but do you think the reason that we still have to continuously ask about or bring web workers up to folks who had never heard of them is that because of the messaging problem with them? Do you think they're very hard to use, and that's one of those trade-offs?
It's not even that they're hard to use; they're annoying to use. Is the way that I would rather put it. Like that might seem like a weird distinction, but like overall, it's pretty simple. You can send messages to them, and then you can listen for messages to come back out of them. But there are a bunch of rules about it that you have to know, and it's like sometimes things just don't work the way that you would expect it to, and there are potential performance overhead depending on what you're doing.
Yeah, I think it's also, when you're very used to working with JavaScript libraries and frameworks and stuff, that use promises or async await or even callbacks, it's quite different to those kind of methods of communicating. And obviously
it feels like an old API.
Yeah, there's other things on the platform like the iframes example that use the post message system, that kind of stuff. So it's not like completely different, but compared to what a lot of people are used to, I think it is quite different. So maybe it puts them off. But again, because they mentioned it quite a lot, CDS, it kind of solidifies that whole best practices. This is the way to solve these types of problems kind of thing, which I thought was really good. Solidifying that that there is these primitives to solve these problems, and this is how you should do it, and not just making it like a kind of like what Danny was saying. It's not like a talk about this is how you should use web workers kind of thing. It's like talks about other things, but then it's just like, oh, and we solved that particular problem with the web worker, which is really good to see. Not just like showing the stuff that you could do with web workers, but showing how they are used to solve actual problems that you would get in like everyday use, which is really kind of cool.
There was a lot of talk about APIs that I think get glossed at times. Web workers was definitely one of those things. It was interesting to see web components come up, not in the same breath necessarily as Polymer or other sort of web component libs, which I thought was good. The Squoosh, the app that they released uses web components, but they don't use Polymer. They were just straight up web components. Don't use Shadow DOM included in those things, which made me chuckle. So, there were a lot of just again APIs that maybe you've forgotten about that sort of go, maybe I should relook at that API and see if I can use it in my project today. Because a lot of them, again, by themselves, maybe you don't want to deal with them. But as part of a bigger plan, as part of a bigger sort of implementation, there was, again, lots of little things on the platform. Again, not even, framework / platform agnostic to some extent. Just these are things you can use, which I like that. I like that thread. I like that kind of line.
So Justin, you brought up Squoosh. So Squoosh makes use of another thing that I know Leon and I are very excited about. But should we actually? I think maybe we should actually talk about what Squoosh is at a high level, and then that will I think that will lead us into how they did it, which will lead us into this other technology.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so Squoosh, from what I understand, it's a cool new app which basically allows you to easily optimize images. Because obviously, again, on the whole performance thing, using optimized images on your site is something that you absolutely need to do instead of just throwing up like a full resolution straight off of the camera kind of thing is not the thing to do. So this is an app where you can basically drop an image on, and you've got loads of options. So you can choose the different, file type, your compression, and all these other kind of cool little settings, which is really easy to use. And then just by using a slider, you can kind of not only obviously optimize the images, but also see what impact it's had on the actual image quality. So just using a slider, you can see that the before and after of the optimizations you've made. So basically, obviously, the idea is to get make the file as small as possible without losing any of the actual visuals and stuff. So that's kind of an overview of the Squoosh app. I don't know whether anybody's got anything to add on top of that.
No, I think that's spot on.
Good. Yeah. Is it a PWA as well? I can't remember.
I'm pretty sure.
I think so. Yeah.
I'd assume so. Yeah. So again, really cool app. If you haven't seen Squoosh, go and check it out. And it uses a lot of as kind of Justin already mentioned, it uses web components. It uses web workers to do a lot of stuff as well, and lots of other kind of best practices to ensure a great experience. And of course, the kind of the way it actually does a lot of the optimizations, the kind of churning of the images themselves, converting them to different formats, and all those other kind of things. It uses WebAssembly, which is the technology that me and Danny in particular are very excited about.
Yeah, and I mean, we just recently did an episode about WebAssembly, talking about some of the things about it. Also, I did just check. Squoosh is absolutely a PWA. I just installed it as a desktop PWA on my Pixelbook, and it looks great. But yeah, so I guess probably we should give a brief recap of what WebAssembly is. Do you just want me to do that?
Go for it.
All right.
Punch it.
All right, I will do my best. Okay, so WebAssembly is a newer runtime for the web. It is not a replacement for JavaScript. which we've been told many times, and we have asked many times, like, what is this? But it is a runtime that is meant to solve problems that JavaScript can't. So it is built to be a compile target. So for example, the three languages that they recommended if you want to write it in production, write it for production now, is C, C++, or Rust. And I think right there that should tell you a little bit about kind of like the target audience maybe of WebAssembly. But yeah, so they have to. So in order to use this, so like the image codecs and things like that to and these different compression algorithms. I don't even know if I'm just saying words now, but like all the actual, like JPEG compression and PNG, whatever other version you can think of, all of those are written in something like C or C++. With WebAssembly, you can compile that into WebAssembly or WASM. So you can compile that C or C++ code into WASM, which is a format that the browsers understand. And I actually just checked, and WebAssembly is actually supported on all the major browsers. So it's on Edge starting at 16. It's runs in Safari starting at 11. iOS Safari starting at 11. So it's actually, again, a very widely supported technology. But you can see the use cases a little bit. And if I remember correctly from the presentation for Squoosh, is that they actually load a web worker, which loads their WASM module and then runs and then does all of this compression stuff. So it's something that would be really, really difficult and very expensive to do in JavaScript, but works very well in C or C++. So being able to pull some of that content into the web is really good. And it's supposed to have performance benefits and other things like that, but it also has, at least currently has limitations. Like doesn't have access to the DOM. I know they announced some multi-threading stuff that's coming. Shared array buffers seem to finally be coming to be a thing, which will help with some of the multi-threading story. But yeah, that's very roughly what WebAssembly is. And if you really do, you should go and look at Squoosh app. Like, it's something that, like, 4 years ago, I never would have thought you could do on the web. It's very, very cool. Does that work? Is that close enough?
Yeah, I think so. I just gave a talk on WebAssembly like 2 days ago, so you're hitting all the highlights.
Hooray!
But no, the Squoosh app, there's so much to sort of dissect out of it. It was a really good talk. But the app itself is really a testament to, I still need all these things from a core level to make it work. Like, if I want to do image compression and I want to use MozJPEG, like, I need to pull MozJPEG. But the boot up time for Squoosh app, it only ships 15K at the start. It lazy loads a lot of things. It uses workers to do that sort of compression that for your images that you don't want to do on the main thread. It has just so many nicely designed parts to it that all sort of seamlessly come together to show that you don't have to ship that ginormous bundle on this upfront to get to an end result that's very good. And again, WebAssembly is just one of those technologies in there that sort of make it work this way. WebAssembly gives you the power to do the output, but the UI, the way everything loads up, like with web components, and it's just sort of the simple sort of boot up. It's just all very clean.
Yeah, and it's using the tools that you know and love now. Like, I'm pretty sure it's also open source. If you go to the website, you can go look. You can go look at. It's under the Google Chrome Labs. You can go take a look at it. All the source code is there, but it uses stuff that it uses Webpack and uses the Webpack CLI. Like, I don't even know what else. Like, there's just a bunch of stuff that it worked. It's using Preact for some of the UI stuff as well. It's like it looks if you go to it, it looks like any other, modern front end web application that you would be looking to use, but it's just doing some pretty remarkable things. And then if you want to look at all the codecs are also in there. If you want to look at, again, it's this thing where it's like, how is this stuff actually working with all of that other stuff? It's very, very cool.
So we are coming up against time. It feels like we could talk about all these different things for ages. So out of any of the other things that we kind of saw at Chrome Dev Summit, is there any particular thing that you guys do not want to miss out of this episode?
Oh, there's so much good stuff there.
Yeah.
If you have not watched the videos, I would definitely say give them a peruse. There was I think we would all agree there was a massive amount of very good content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we spoke to a lot of people at Chrome Dev Summit as well on some of these particular announcements and those kind of things. So we're hoping to schedule quite a few episodes going into detail about particular things that were announced on the show. For example, we've already done an episode on VisBug, which is really cool. So hopefully keep an eye out, and we'll try and do some more in-depth episodes on particular things we've been talking about already, and some of the things we're not going to get time to. But so I would really like to just quickly talk about web packaging and portals, because basically I don't fully understand exactly how they work, what they really are, but they certainly sound very interesting. So I'm hoping that you guys can shed some light for me and explain kind of how they work. So portals is something that seems quite interesting to me. It basically seems like, obviously, links is how the web's built, and going from one website to another is such a fundamental part of the web. And to me, portals, from what I understood, were basically a way to kind of basically pre-cache an entire site somehow, so that when a user presses on a link to go to another external website, it kind of blows instantly. Is that true?
Yeah. So
I don't know.
The notion is that it's trying to get it so that you can do seamless transitions as you navigate between both pages on a site and as well as sort of between sites. So the current variation of it is that it'll basically allow a page to basically show an inset, to show another page as its inset variation, and then you can seamlessly transition between that thing that's been inset as on the navigated state. So I feel like I'm hacking that up pretty bad, but that's generally the gist, is that it's ideally it gives you this really smooth sort of approach to being able to say, oh, go to this next thing and append this here. And now it's kind of like a frame, but it's because you can talk about post message. Post message is part of that spec too, so that you can navigate through it. So yeah, portals I think will be very interesting. It is in Chrome right now, so definitely take a look. What was the other one you said? Web packaging, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds cool, but again, I didn't really fully understand exactly what it was.
So the notion of web packaging is that you could basically have a sort of signed bundle that says this is a collection to make this thing work. And it becomes sort of important when you're trying to make sure that the integrity of the thing you're shipping, as well as things that are cached on sort of point of presence edged, sort of work the same. So an example might be is if you're serving something that, which might be a problem now. So let's say that your content security policy says that I want to make sure that only these things are from my domain. And the problem is let's say that you're trying to ship into somewhere that doesn't have a lot of connectivity. So let's say that it's just somewhere random, and the connectivity is poor. So you say, well, I'm going to put this other domain thing over here, which gives me some basically edge presence in that country. All of a sudden now your CSP policy would fail, right? Because now it's like, oh, well, I don't know what that thing is, but it's the faster of the two. And now I've got this sort of broken sort of thing. The notion is that web packaging sort of deals with this by saying, well, this is a signed sort of package. I could put it on that edge server. It would load up on this thing and it'd still be mine because I can verify that it was this thing. And again,
okay.
I'm rapidly saying this, but that's kind of the gist. Web packaging would be very, very cool as well. Like that would make life just really, really quite nice. When you need to sort of make sure that you have these sort of things that need to be sent with this thing in a place that you don't necessarily control. So yeah, those two technologies together, I think will be really, really quite good in terms of the portability of the thing that you want to experience in terms of content delivery.
We'll try and make sure that we get some deeper documentation or whatever on these two technologies in the show notes, so people who are interested can have a more in-depth read about what they actually kind of mean. But cool, thanks for that, Justin. That certainly cleared a few things up for me.
Not a problem. as I rapid fire do it. But yeah, I think there's just so much good stuff. Again, there was almost 1,000. I think there was 1,000 something people there this year, and it continues to grow as a conference for Chrome Dev Summit. You see the sort of camaraderie that everyone sort of has in trying to make the web better, not just for developers but for end users. We want to make those experiences faster, and I think that's great to see. And the conversations were great, and do watch the videos.
Definitely. And if somebody's listening, wants us to cover a particular thing that happened in Chrome Dev Summit in like much greater detail, then let us know on Twitter, and we'll try and get an episode scheduled if we can reach out to the appropriate people who can help us do that. So yeah, let us know. Yeah,
the 2019 show schedule is looking really great right now. As we round out 2018.
Absolutely.
Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up episode number 178 of the Web Platform Podcast. That's what happens when you say the word platform constantly all the time. Danny, Leon, and I have been talking about Chrome Dev Summit, all the cool things we saw, some of the things that we still don't quite understand, and sort of the very bright future for the web. We appreciate you tuning in, and we hope to see you next week as we talk more things web, more things platform. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.